I don't. Yeah. Now it's working. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm delighted that we managed to fill the room. I'm sure millions more are watching online. My name is Natalia Antelava. I am a co-founder and editor-in-chief of Coda Story. We are a thematic newsroom that covers roots of global crisis, and we are non-profit. But before I co-founded Coda, I spent most of my career working as a reporter for the BBC. And one of the biggest culture shocks of going from traditional mainstream media, where correspondents of two different programs compete with each other over stories that they do, the same stories about the same subject that they do, let alone, collaborate. One of the shocks was coming into the world of nonprofit journalism, where partnership is really sort of seems to have become absolute key to survival and operations. But our partnerships, both extremely trendy and important. So which one is it? And is it a buzzword, or is it more than that? And we have, I actually have plenty of questions myself, because partnerships are notoriously difficult to pull off. But we have an amazing panel today of people who have pulled them off in pretty significant ways. So. And I am very keen, because of COVID regulations, we're not able to bring you into the conversation in real time, but please, you can DM me on Twitter. It's Antelava, just my last name, and it's on the program if you have questions and or just want to contribute, because I can see many of you who also have a lot of experience with partnerships as well. So. DM, and I'll keep an eye on my DMs, and I'll try to ask the questions. So to introduce the panel, Scilla Alecci is the partnerships coordinator for Asia and Europe at ICIJ, and also a reporter. And we have Lina Attalah, who is the publisher of Mada Masr, Mary Fitzgerald, until very recently with Open Democracy, and now the Director of Expression at the OSF, and Nic Dawes, who is the Executive Editor of The City in New York, and also, for full disclosure, Chairman of Coda's board as well. So to start with, and Scilla, I'd like to start with you. I mean, ICIJ, obviously, of all organizations, if anyone can do partnerships well, it's probably you. And we were just talking that you started out as a partner and a journalist at the Panama Papers. Is that right? Sort of one of the symbols of amazing journalistic collaboration that works. And now you're leading partnerships at the organization. Can you tell us what it is that makes it work? How do you pull them off?
Hi, everyone. ICIJ, well, this year we turned 5 since we became independent, and we became independent after Panama Papers, and which is, I think, one of the most popular investigations that we've done so far. Over the years, ICIJ has developed kind of an expertise in collaborations, because that's at the core of our mission. ICIJ is a nonprofit based in Washington, and we only do international investigations. We are a very small team of reporters, data journalists, and tech people. And our strength is in the work with other journalists around the world. When we think about collaborations, we don't think about distributing our work on multiple platforms. For us, collaborations means really working alongside journalists in other countries, any country. The last project that we did, the Pandora Papers, involved more than 600 journalists from dozens of countries around the world. collaborating with those reporters means also empowering journalism in those countries, especially where, media laws and protection for journalism are very, very weak. And we learn from them. The idea at the beginning of ICIJ, there was the idea that if criminals can use cross-border networks to become rich, then journalists had to, become better than them and innovate, because, law enforcement and other, authorities, they have legal restrictions. If you want to subpoena someone in another country, you have to ask permission to that country's authority. But if you are a journalist, of course you don't have subpoena power, but you can collaborate with journalists in that country to get sources, get information, and get to the bottom of to get the truth. That's what we do. And so over time, we developed technologies and procedures to make this happen, and which are very strict. But I think the most important, there are two basic concepts to make this work. First is trust, because before we choose journalists that we work with, we have to trust them. We work with them for many months in secret, and so we have to be sure that, first of all, they don't disclose what we are talking about until everyone can, go and ask for questions, etc. And also that they don't collaborate with the governments. They are independent. And then also they respect journalists in other parts of the world. There are a lot of power dynamics that go on in the media industry, and so part of our job as coordinators of this project is also to make sure that these power dynamics are kind of balanced out and that everyone has their fair share, and not that the powerful media or the powerful journalists take over, the weaker ones. And then the second pillars of the collaborations is what we call radical sharing. So when we work on projects, we share everything with our partners. We share interviews, we share doubts, questions, we share comment requests. Many times it's ICIJ's reporters like me who go and ask for comments to powerful people if journalists in those countries would be exposed. So it's also, collaboration becomes also a form of protection for our colleagues. And radical sharing means that really everyone contributes to that, so that the final story, the final investigation, the final product is nuanced as possible, as in-depth as possible. And because, the stories that we tackle are bigger than us, bigger than each individual journalist's egos. And so the idea is to overcome the concept of journalists as a lone wolf and really work together to expose injustice.
So I would love to dig in some more into kind of the editorial work around such scale of collaborations. But before we do that, I wanted to go to Nic with a question about, so ICIJ obviously has built this infrastructure. And in our experience too, as a small nonprofit newsroom, partnerships have worked the best when we were helped by an organization that had given you that infrastructure to basically both collaborate and share. How does it work on the individual newsroom level for you, Nic?
So the organization, the news organization that I run, The City, you can find it online, thecity.nyc. It exists because even though New York City looks like the media capital of the world, in many ways coverage of New York's neighborhoods, of its government, of its hurly-burly politics and social life has been hollowed out dramatically over the last 20 years. And even when it wasn't hollowed out dramatically, it really represented the perspectives of people in a very complex and diverse town. So our small newsroom was created to respond to that big problem. And we have the fortune of being only 3 years old. So that means we can build our newsroom and build our processes and approach in a way that, of course, rests on some traditional journalistic virtues, but that also builds in some of the insights and lessons that we've learned more recently, including about collaboration and partnership. And so we're trying to build a newsroom from the ground up that's created to grow in a way that incorporates relationships with others and that incorporates partnerships at different levels and of different kinds, so that it's part of our institutional DNA and part of our infrastructure and part of our workflows and part of our KPAs, if you want to get down to the HR dimensions of it. So what does that look like for us in practice? It can look like the kind of partnership that everyone talks about most easily. We will work on one story together and publish it across platforms. Of course, we do that. That's a very, very minimum 1.0 approach, right? And to do that and make that work, clearly, in our experience, it works when both sides bring something to the table that's of equal value, and that's recognized. Trust is very important. And you work towards a common outcome. But more than that, we are trying to do a range of deeper kinds of partnerships. So because we're a local newsroom with real expertise in a place and how the place works, its communities, its laws, and a local audience, we're often a good place for the whole breed of new specialist thematic national newsrooms to touch down. So at the moment, for example, we have 2 reporters embedded with us for a year, each of them. One from the Fuller Project that works on issues affecting women and gender, and she reports on the care economy and questions affecting women in New York City, and she's fully part of our editorial team. Stories are edited jointly across the 2 platforms. And co-published. But she works in our newsroom, comes to our news meetings, and is fully part of our team in every possible way. And we have a MOU.
And you went to Fuller with that as a proposal, basically?
Because they came to us initially about doing a story, and then we developed it into a bigger relationship. And similarly with ProPublica, we have a reporter from ProPublica for a year who's just published her first story, which is about access to mental health care in New York City and New York State. Very deep mix of data reporting and individual stories and policy. And we have people who are steeped in all of those issues from a New York perspective, and we work with ProPublica on the editing. So that's a very fertile approach for us and something we want to do more of. But one of the things we've realized is that you then have to have editing capacity and relationship management capacity that's scaled for that. You can't just clip it on. And just add more people, because there's a huge amount of work and cost that goes with it.
And again, I would love to dig in more into the relationship management thing, especially with both of you. But very quickly, before we move on to Lina, ProPublica, you mentioned ProPublica, and it's often being sort of held up as this, the innovator of partnerships, and that first, they were seem to be the first who did it differently. Are you building on from what they have done in the partnership space? Are you doing things differently?
I think we're doing things a bit differently because of this very close embedding relationship, and the sense that the partner reporter is part of our team. We're also looking at, in a couple of cases, not quite ready for prime time, but what we'll call a shared reporter, where we co-fund a reporter with a specialist outfit and specifically fundraise against those objectives. And you have to have all the legal stuff in place. And the first time around you do it, there's lots of friction, but then it becomes easier and easier. The other thing we're doing that's a bit different is we partner in a way with journalism schools and with our communities. We have a project called Missing Them, which is a response to the fact that pandemic obituaries in New York City were mainly for rich, white, male people. And we created a place where all New Yorkers can request an obituary, and we have a network of partners in journalism schools and volunteer former journalists who report and write those obituaries, and they're captured in a digital archive. And again, that takes a lot of management. Someone has to look after it, but it's not a partnership with another news outlet per se, but with a distributed network of J schools and individuals that really enriches the work. So part of the idea here is if you do partnership only as a response to scarcity or as an audience play, you only get half the benefit. If you understand it as a way to really realize something journalistically that you couldn't do any other way, then you can start to build a different kind of institution around it.
Right. So obviously, both of you, without answering the question of the headline question of the panel, is it the buzzword or the or a real or the future? You kind of are basically saying that you're building whole models around it, integrated into.
Well, it could be just a buzzword, and then it's not very interesting, and then no one should have come to this session, right? And you'll hear the same stories about how we got more audience from doing the same thing, which is
Lina, I want to ask you. I mean, for your newsroom operating in Egypt and in, sort of the wider Arab world, for your journalism organizations, what do partnerships mean to you, and how important are they?
So we have also engaged in cross-border investigations, and we are very much aware of how they've come to define the notion of partnership in this landscape of journalism, and they've been very useful, not just in terms of the subject matter of what we're investigating, but also in terms of exposing our reporters to different modalities of sifting through data, dealing with data sets of different sizes. And this has been very useful, although, and I think Scilla mentioned this, there are always the governing power dynamics of the very ways in which the data is sifted through and the investigation is conducted, and a lot of the times, even though there is the shareability and all these dynamics, but also there is one specific form in which ways are being done, and this has been very useful, but at the same time, we always like to diversify ways in which we think of investigative work, especially in a context where there is a scarcity of data. But also, for us, it's not, as Nic said, it's not just about collaborations that are oriented towards publishing or working together on content in a context where you have political repression, a lot of closures. It is important to also engage on a more radical infrastructure level. I talked yesterday in another panel on networks and network building about how it's like to work in journalism in Egypt nowadays, and it feels like a desert in the desert. So everybody knows probably that Egypt is very much a desert, but working in journalism, in independent journalism now feels very much like a professional desert. So this is why we've had to actively move towards building not just a partnership, an alliance actually with like-minded media in the region, and our collaborations were not very interested at the beginning in publishing together or investigating things together, but actually in strengthening the resilience of our infrastructure at a very basic level by working together. So going and lobbying donors together to move towards more core funding as opposed to, for example, programmatic funding that is very short-sighted and much more responsive to the mandate and missions of the donor, and less the need for building resilient institutions within these contexts. It's also a partnership that is centered on intellectually and politically defining and redefining what does it mean to be progressive today in this region. For example, what's our position vis-a-vis Russia? What's our position vis-a-vis what's happening in Syria? Is it the same vis-a-vis our relationship with the Israel-Palestine conflict, for example? So it's also creating a space where there is political conversation, again, in a context where we're not allowed to have these conversations. If we're talking about our Syrian partners, for example, all of them are in exile now, right? And forced to act as this diasporic community first and foremost, right? In Egypt, there is barely any space for, independent, deep, intelligent political conversation. So partnership here plays that role. Of course, to be more specific, we've built a network that's called February, which is the Arabic word for February, and that's because we spent years meeting in February in an Arab city every year to basically define what is it that we want out of this network, until we actually instituted it in Berlin as an alternative home to those of us who need to flee. I haven't yet, thankfully, but others had to. And it's a space where we invest together resources, like I said before, in lobbying funders, instead of each of us going to a separate tech provider to provide tech tools for our websites and so on. So we are investing in one pooled resource.
Much more existential than
very much so, very much so. But also, I mentioned the political because even though it's very practical, very utilitarian, it's also a very much political alliance in the sense that there is this conversation of what does it mean to be progressive in today's world. So, yeah.
Mary, you're bridging two worlds for us, and you've done some interesting partnership stuff with the Open Democracy, which we would love to hear about, but also what insights are you bringing into the philanthropy, into the donor world?
I think the chief reason I took the job actually at OSF, despite feeling still like a journalist in my soul, is because I realized after running Open Democracy for 7 years, that we were never going to get anywhere as an independent media sector if we didn't share much, much, much more than we are now. And, you know, I had dreams of sharing a really good HR person with another organization, or like an absolute, you know, finance whiz. Or I kept saying to funders when I was at Open Democracy, build us a house, put us all in the same building. Make us not pay rent, and we'll collaborate. So I had this dream that actually, as a funder, I was hoping that we could build shared infrastructure, whether that's technology or very unsexy things like HR and finance functions. There are some great organizations out there that do pro bono legal support for journalists and have networks of lawyers that can play across defamation to data protection, privacy, to sedition, to terrorism, to all the things that journalists get accused of these days. And there's some really interesting innovation going on in the types of legal support that can be funded and scaled to respond to those growing threats and challenges. So really the reason I'm doing the job I'm doing now is because it seemed crazy to me that we were all building our own castles or trying to build our own castles with insufficient amounts of money. And if we as funders, as donors, can catalyze more sharing and fund things that people can share and build things that people can share, then that might be greater than any individual grant we can give.
So we're all moving into the same buildings.
We're building a house. I mean, obviously, in many contexts, you can't build a house, right? You can't acquire an office building. You would make the organizations you support a target. Yeah. But there are plenty of places you can, and actually even speaking to those working in some pretty intense authoritarian contexts, they still say to us, well, they know us anyway. If we're all in the same building, we might get better security. So it's quite interesting to think what's possible.
Yeah. So I have a question for both of you. So for us at Coda, partnerships are also very much about, actually for all of you, maybe less with your big investigations, but partnerships are also very much about audience as well. You know, it's a way of reaching the audience. I mean, Lina, with Egypt especially, you know, my experience of sort of the working with partners in Russia and Belarus, for example, in these repressive societies, they tend to, you know, people create networks, but they tend to share the audience. Is that your experience in the Middle East as well? Or is this also about the audience as a way of getting to new audiences? And then, yeah, Mary, if you just want to pick up. And if any of you want to just jump in, please do.
Well, I think what happened with our media is that we started off about 9 years ago with, you know, a small audience that shared an affinity with our project, our political project as independent journalists, and then with time we benefited from the crisis of a total scarcity in independent media in the country and grew our audience exponentially, only for the government to realize that and to block our website back in 2017. And this was an important moment of partnership because we basically started reaching out to other organizations whose websites have started to be blocked. They started with us, the government, and then moved on to blocking websites en masse, including human rights organizations, websites, and so on. And this is, for example, a type of audience-related partnership or collaboration we've been having. So we've been coming together, those of us who have blocked websites, be it from the human rights world or that other small independent newsroom that also has a blocked website, and we've been talking together about the different things that we could do. So for example, we opted differently because also notions of impact tend to descend upon us in the region somehow. So how can we think of impact and metrics a bit differently through, again, this conversation between these different newsrooms in the network? So.
Thanks. Yeah, audience is definitely part of the reason why we did partnerships at Open Democracy. It was really part of our theory of change, was that we needed to reach outside of our filter bubble if there was anything of because our audience was largely progressive, centre, left-leaning, and mainly Remainers, and there was a real civil war going on in Britain about this at the time. It was bitter and vitriolic. And we wanted people to know the facts about what had been done and what was claimed and what was true and what wasn't. So for us, it was very important to get into those right-wing papers. I think there's also something important there, thinking about how funders can be partners rather than just funders. I think the word partnership is overused in the funding space. Often you are not really partnering, you're handing out money, and have to be very aware of that power dynamic and very conscious of it. But the best funding relationships I've had as a grantee is where you can really talk to your funders about your problems, about the challenges you're facing, the gaps you have. So for example, back in 2019, when we were doing a lot of work on the European elections and the threat from the far right and the alt-right and the kind of international connections, Steve Bannon and all his crew, we had a number of stories that were really important that went out in for a number of different countries, Hungary, Italy, etc. And we just didn't have the bandwidth to place those stories with those audiences. We normally did it on a peer-to-peer, so we don't have a PR person, we don't have a comms person, journalist to journalist. We would let our colleagues know and sort of pitch our stories to them, but we didn't have the capacity to do it at that scale, and we didn't have the relationships. So I remember talking actually to someone at OSF and saying, I just give my left arm for a really decent press officer right now. And he said, oh, we have an account with the firm. Use it. And that was more useful than the funding they gave us to do the journalism itself, because it meant, again, that our stories were landing in right of centre Italian news wires. And that had an absolutely outsized impact. So,
that's a great tip, actually.
Yeah.
That has never occurred to me. But
yeah. It's always worth just saying, I wish I had X or Y, because sometimes there's an answer, and it can be quite left field.
Right. Yeah. Because the bandwidth issue is such a huge issue, right? Because a lot of the sometimes donors love the kind of the word and love the concept, but it takes a lot of, Nic, you mentioned relationship management, and it takes a lot to pull off a partnership. Do you have any tips on how to do it if the bandwidth is limited? Is it even worth going there?
Everything in a newsroom, right, is a choice about resource allocation. Your whole news diary is a choice about resource allocation. So, the first thing I think is you have to decide what stuff you care about. And if you care about this and you value it, then you have to allocate resources to it. Not just say to editors, we think partnership is a good thing, or it's a buzzword, so let's do some of that. You have to make it part of your conversation about performance. You have to make it part of your assessment about how many people you have doing what. We're adding 2 new editors at the moment, and allocating a little more of our resources there than to growing our reporting team, because our existing editors who work with our partners and who have to support them in making sense of New York are incredibly overstretched. So we're making a decision about the structure of our newsroom. I would have loved to add a second climate reporter, for example. But that wouldn't solve the bandwidth problem. And if adding another editor who has capacity to do this work can maybe open us up to working with 3 external partners. So I think...
Do you have someone managing partnerships, or is it just part of the job of
No, we
every-
have someone who manages the external publishing relationships.
And is that the person's sole job?
And no, it's part of a job that involves kind of communication.
Right.
But each of our editors works with our partners, and the idea is that they all understand the value of partnership to our approach. So we're trying to, sometimes when you mainstream things, you dilute them to the point where you don't see them anymore, but the idea is to build it into the basis of everything. And then the person who works on comms worked with our one-person engineering team to create a tracking pixel so we can see on the audience side, where things are going.
And Lina, is that the same, and I'll come to it, is that the same for you? Is it kind of embedded in the newsroom overall, or do you have is it siloed out to a person who is looking after partnerships?
No, it's never just one person. Making partnerships also is a form of privilege. So, you get to think of possibilities of partnerships when you travel, when you go to conferences, and a lot of the times if you're just in the mechanicity of news gathering, which is primarily what we do, it's not very easy to constantly think of partnerships. So it's important also to link, being alert to possibilities of partnerships to the leadership of organizations, not in a sense of secluding the thinking about partnerships within the management or the leadership, but also just the privilege of leadership comes with it. It comes with it the idea of thinking what partnerships matter, I would say.
So slightly like digging in, I mean, obviously you are all about partnerships, right? That's most of the job. So what are the most likely mistakes that you see other people make? Like, what are things that make it work for you? I mean, you talked about this incredible projects where you get 600. To be honest, like, I can't imagine how you get 600 reporters from different newsrooms around the world to collaborate together. It is a bit of a mystery to me. But so how do you give us some practical kind of things on how you do it?
So I'm a reporter, but I'm also a coordinator, and other colleagues of mine are both reporters and so it's basically two jobs. It's not one. So I mean, it's not a secret that we work a lot, like, I don't know, many hours a day. It's not an 8-hour job when you have that. But obviously it pays off when you see journalists on the other side of the world working with you, getting excited about stories, about findings, about investigating, the most powerful people in their country, and you can expose that at an international level. So, but how we practically do that? So we have each of our teams is basically caters to, we think of ourselves as a service provider in a way, because we do reporting, but we also do data analysis, and we also develop technologies for our partners. So we have our platforms to, for example, whenever we get leaks or other kinds of documents, to browse these documents, and every partner get access to the same platform, so everyone around the world can get access to that. We have a specific platform that we developed for partners so that they can share information. It's a bit like a Facebook, a private Facebook thing, so that if you find something in Georgia that you're gonna post that there, and someone maybe in the UK can say, oh, I found that guy in London, he has a property. So that's how we develop it.
Project specific. It's not kind of a general conversation. We're looking for a new story.
No, it's very project specific. So every time we have a project, we set up this infrastructure. Obviously, these platforms are, they get better and better every year, but they're basically, the idea is the same. So we have one to share documents and the other one to share, the findings. And it's very deliberate. So I think the most common mistake is when you have a collaboration just for the sake of having a collaboration, and it, you could, even if you don't have it, it doesn't, and that's how you get the best result. The other thing is also get that the mistake is when people don't communicate, because it's a bit like a long-distance relationship. People are busy, they're gonna forget